Hey guys, it's Leanna, and I'm here today to talk about the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This video is going to be somewhat controversial, I want to say, because I know the Mistborn trilogy is well beloved, and for good reason. However, I am going to be mainly focusing on my criticisms of the trilogy because they are not criticisms that I have seen, and they are not things that I knew about before going into it, which is surprising to me that something that's so widely read is something that I've only heard praise for, and I've never heard anyone criticize it for the things that I found distasteful. So I would like to speak up for those out there that, like me, would have liked to know this before they read it. That said, this is going to be a spoilery discussion. My issues are more sort of broad strokes issues, so it will be spoilery, but I can't think of much that I would say that would be that specifically spoilery in terms of like actual events, specific character arcs, or anything like that. But I might, so I just want to warn you that it may be a little bit spoilery, though it will largely be broad strokes. Now, I do also want to, again, not disclaimers per se, but I want to be clear before I get into criticizing the author and these books, that I do believe that Brandon Sanderson is a talented individual. I do believe that he is a good writer, and my criticisms in no way take away from that. So everything that I will be saying, please bear in mind that I do think that he's a talented man, and I do think that he's done a lot that is to be applauded. That said, he gets a lot of applause already for this, so I'm not here to add to that applause. I'm here to be a voice of dissent and to point out the things that are certainly less than perfect in my opinion and make me angry enough to want to film this video. So I guess without further ado, let's get into why the Mistborn trilogy pissed me off. So if you're not familiar with the Mistborn trilogy at all, I kind of don't know why you're watching this video, because I feel like, well, for those of you who don't know, the Mistborn trilogy is set in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, and this follows the story of various people who live in a world where the premise in the outset is that what if the Dark Lord won? So they've for 1,000 years have been living under an oppressive authoritarian regime where like a Sauron type is basically in charge, and there's ash falling from the skies and everything is pretty bad. But the magic system revolves around people ingesting metals. So not everyone can do this, but certain people called mistings are able to ingest and use one kind of metal to do a certain kind of thing. Each metal does a different thing, and so if you're physically able to burn that kind of metal, then you can do that certain thing. So it's different sort of magical things. So one of the metals gives you the ability to sort of, like all of the Force, pull on metal or push on metal. One of them enables you to see and hear better. One of them enables you to be physically stronger. And you only have those abilities while you have the metal inside you and you sort of burn through it, the way you'd burn through food for fuel. So they have to continually ingest small amounts of this metal if they want to keep being able to do this magical thing. And Mistborn are people that can use all the metals to do all the things. So they're the most powerful. That's sort of a brief overview of how the world works and how the magic system works. So the first book is a heist story, in essence. Some of the poor, low echelon people in this society want to overthrow the Lord Ruler. So the whole story follows their attempt to overthrow the Lord Ruler. And then this I guess is kind of spoilery, which is why I warned you. The second and third books sort of follow the same characters in the aftermath of the Lord Ruler's overthrow, and how to rebuild society and what to do about some magical repercussions that they were not expecting. So, all that said, it's a great magic system, it's well told, it's well built, it's well explained, it never breaks its own rules. Well done. So, again, Brandon Sanderson deserves all the praise in the world for being able to craft something so well, so thoroughly, so consistently, and, etc. Like, good job, great job. Why do I have such an issue with this series? I went into these books knowing that Brandon Sanderson himself is Mormon, which in and of itself isn't going to be a reason for me to not pick something up, just because I know an author is religious, unless I've heard that they're, actively hurting people or actively, persecuting people because of some religious or moral belief. I don't care if an author holds a particular belief or is a member of a certain faith. They're writing a story, so it doesn't, unless they're actively hurting people in their own personal life, I don't care. However, going into it, I was prepared for the fact that Mormon values would be reflected, but Tolkien also, when he wrote the Lord of the Rings, his very Catholic values were reflected. He wasn't, evangelizing, but he was telling a story wherein his very Catholic values are reflected in what is considered morally good in his world. So, I was ready for that. And so, as I was reading the books, I was frankly surprised by how gray and how layered and how complex his representation of what faith is and what religion is was. And the way the characters would question it or debate it or sort of wonder about it. And it seemed like it was going to be just like in the real world, where there isn't anything that anyone is ever going to be able to point at as absolute proof. So the characters can debate it endlessly without ever coming to a concrete conclusion, because that is how faith works. I believe this for these reasons, but I can't prove it to you. Which, that's how a debate like that would go in our real world. So I appreciated how complex that was and anthropological it was. There was all these discussions of all these various faiths that they had come across or discovered or had once existed, and they were discussing. That wasn't the ultimate, that wasn't the main action of the book, but it was definitely heavily in there. And I remember mentioning to someone how frankly surprised and refreshed I was by the fact that an author that I happen to know was Mormon was willing to examine faith in such a complex and gray way, where it wasn't very black and white, where it wasn't very overtly, conveying a very specific religious message. And I was impressed by that. And he was building this great fantasy world. And I was like, this is good stuff. And then I read book 3. And it turns out that I was totally wrong about that. He was not discussing faith and religion in a gray and layered way. Everything in this trilogy, every magical occurrence, every question you had, every twist in the story, was all leading towards this ultimate and extremely religious conclusion, where it leaves you without any shadow of doubt about what faith is meant to be the right one, what morals are meant to be the right ones. The people who abided by this are rewarded, and in as overt a way as possible, godly good triumphs over, ruin. And it was so overt that it was painful for me to read about. And it wasn't simply the fact that it was religious, because I'm not objecting to the fact of religion being in there or religious values being reflected. If it had been a political message that had been just as overtly shoved down my throat, I'd be just as mad about it. So I want to be clear that it's not specific to it being a religious message that I object to. This happened to be a religious message. I'm objecting to how overtly this story is no longer a story. It is simply a tool to convey and to promote this message and this worldview. And to me, that's not a story anymore. The fact that a story might make you wonder these things, or it might, again, generally reflect an author's values, I expect it and it's fine, and that can be great. But if, as was the case here, at least when I read it, that's how it felt to me, that the way that everything ties into and everything culminates in, not something that happens to have a faithful element, everything culminates in an extremely religious conclusion, to the point where everything in the story, without exception, is part of this puzzle of religion that is explained at the end as being the purpose of it all. Where everything that you didn't realize was even tied into it, it's all tied into this religious thing. Then I retroactively couldn't even enjoy the book that I loved. The second book I thought was so good. I wanted to immediately read the third book because there were so many questions and it was so interesting and the world building was so cool and I wanted to know more because he is a good writer. He made me want to read more. And then I felt tricked and betrayed because I was sucked into this fantasy world only to be bashed on the head with a heavily religious message. Why? You certainly have not convinced me of anything by doing this. I would argue that if your purpose was, I don't know if he's actually trying to convert anyone through this story. I have no idea. But being that it was so overtly in there, I feel like I say overt so much, but I can't think of a better word to describe how painfully heavy-handed and obvious it was. That this lack of subtlety, it ensured that I would not absorb this message. People in my experience and in my opinion, are more willing to accept an idea if they believe it's their own. So if you asked questions, posed situations, made people wonder the right things, you might guide them to a view or a message that is ultimately the one that you wanted them to land at. But if you scream it at them, they're gonna shut down, as I did. I would say that I was no longer able to enjoy it as a fantasy story because I felt like I was being preached to, and the preaching didn't work because it was so overt. So I would prefer them not preaching to me, period. I would prefer them to just tell a good fantasy story that may or may not toss in some religious questions. But if you are going to preach to me, I advise you to be more subtle about it, because it'll work a lot better. I will be much more receptive to your message if you're not ramming it down my throat. So that's my criticism of the Mistborn books. And that's why I want to say that this is not a rant review, because I felt the most betrayed by this because I do think that he's a great author. I do think that he is a talented world builder. I do think that reading his books was an enjoyable experience until I discovered their purpose. So I would prefer him to use this considerable talent, and he does have considerable talent, to just tell a good story. I mean, this can't have been an accident. That's why I say that religious views being reflected in a story are necessarily going to happen. If those are your views, you write what you know, you write what you believe. It's going to be in there, whether you mean it to be or not. This was purposeful. This wasn't an accident. So the fact that his own views would shine through in any story he wrote and would tend to have, again, the values that he holds would be reflected there. I would expect that, and it would be fine. But there's no way that this was not intentional. Every single bit of this extremely meticulously crafted world and story was all leading towards the most absurdly, heavy-handedly, and overtly religious message that I think I've ever read in a fantasy story. It was just so heavy. I can't express enough how much it was, to the point where I was not even in the story anymore. In the third book, as I was reading it, every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every page, I was looking at it and observing the religious message that was being crafted. I was no longer in the story. And at that point, you failed. You failed in telling a story, and you failed to convert me to your message. So whichever it was your endeavor, you failed in both. And that's such a shame, because I was really enjoying these books. I thought they were really, really well written. And I remain impressed with his ability to craft something so complex, even though it resolved in something so absurdly religious. I object to an overt message at the end of a book, or throughout a book, or anything like that. You can play with ideas, you can suggest ideas, you can ask interesting questions, your values can be reflected in the type of story that you tell. But to craft something so thoroughly and so meticulously with the ultimate purpose of ramming your religious views down my throat, I think that's disingenuous. So I want to say I do recommend Sanderson as an author, which is to say I think that he writes worlds well, he tells stories well, and for that reason he should be praised and he should be read. But I'm upset and offended and betrayed and hurt by the fact that he would do this. I feel, tricked is the best way I can think to describe it. I feel tricked. And I would have liked to know that, I guess, before I read it. Although then I probably wouldn't have read it. So let me know in the comments down below if you've read the Mistborn books, if you felt this way about them at all. If you think I'm totally wrong, please let me know. Again, I do think it's quality, so if I can see why people love these books, for sure. I'm not entirely sure, so if you do love these books, let me know if you love them because of this religious message, in spite of this religious message, or if, as far as you're concerned, you didn't even see a religious message in there and you think that I've read too much into it. I find that hard to believe, but if that's the case, please let me know. Because that was sort of a ruiner for me, and I wanted to love this series very much. So yeah, let me know in the comments down below, all things Mistborn related, and I'll see you in my next video.